Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the work that you are doing around the world, and grateful that we get to be a small part of what you are doing, whether that's through financial support, prayer support, or actually being on the ground in some of these places. And so we are grateful that we get to do the work of your kingdom. Lord Jesus, as we come into the text this morning, I pray that we would be receptive to the move of your Spirit, that we would receive what your word has to teach us this morning, and that this would be something that you would use to affect in our lives, in how we think about you and how we think about the world, in how we worship you and in how we follow you. And so I pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. I don't know if you're aware, I don't watch a ton of news, but I am aware of the news. And a few months ago, the news was full of the revelations about the newly released Epstein files. And without going into a lot of detail about what those files exposed, it did show one thing, I think, pretty clearly. It showed that there is a group of wealthy, powerful, influential men and women, some women, who engaged in acts of horrific abuse simply because they could. And because they believed that their wealth and their power and their influence made them above the law and would shield them from consequences. They believed they could do any depraved thing they wished to, whoever they wished to do it to, and get away with it. As we saw in Jason's sermon last week, just a little bit, we saw that worldly power structures can be dangerous. And those who hold power often seem to bend others to their will. And it seems like they can get away with any number of unspeakably evil things. And worldly power hasn't changed from the days of Esther until now. And I bring up the Epstein files because a similar thing happens here in chapter 2, where young women are taken away from their families to be used by the rich and the powerful. And so to begin today, we have to recognize that there have always been powerful forces and powerful people in our world, spiritual powers, principalities, and authorities who seem to be able to get away with anything. And it's actually been this way since sin entered the world. As Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is nothing new under the sun. I think for many of us, the chaos of the world makes us feel uncertain. What do we do when there are so many events outside of our control? There are wars, rumors of war, wealthy men abusing children, AI-generated content making us question everything we see and hear, mental health crises in our younger generations. The list of things that you could be fearful about or angry about or concerned about just kind of continues to go on. And the world is not the way that we want it to be. We cannot control it. We want to control the uncontrollable, but we soon find that we cannot. We simply are not the ones in charge. Events will happen that we have no control over. And while we might feel that this is some sort of new era of uncertainty, it's really just the way the world has always been. Unpredictable, complex, and outside of our control. There is nothing new under the sun. Yet, through this uncertainty, God's sovereign hand is at work, and ultimately in control of what we cannot control. And even when it looks like evil is winning, God's ultimate purposes and plans can't be derailed. The book of Esther reveals to us the hidden power of God that works underneath the surface, often invisible to us and seen only in how later it disrupts the worldly power systems that often have led to evil. We often find that those in our world who have control, who have worldly power and worldly wealth and influence, are often not looking out for the good of others. And the choices of a select few can bring devastation to many. We begin our text picking up in the aftermath of King Xerxes' drunken celebration. So you remember last week, if you were here, that Xerxes had called his queen Vashti to come to him when he was in high spirits from the wine. So this wasn't a planned moment. This was a moment of impulsivity brought on by a lot of wine. Vashti's refusal to come to this unplanned and exploitative request makes Xerxes furious. And just to put it into context, if a woman came to you and said, when my husband gets drunk, he wants me to come out and stand in front of all of his friends, should I do that? Probably say, no, you shouldn't do that. So Vashti refuses. And that makes Xerxes furious. And he removes Vashti as queen. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So we're going to be in Esther chapter 2. You can just follow along. We're starting in verse 1, going through verse 17. Let me pause here. Finding a queen in this manner is a ridiculous waste of resources. It requires a massive expenditure, with officers appointed in all 127 provinces to locate beautiful virgins and ensure their delivery to Susa. Once there, they're placed in the care of the keeper of the harem, and they would receive extensive beauty treatments, which of course requires costly ingredients for each woman, perfumes and lotions and powders, and not to mention all the food and the clothing for all of these girls. It's a huge amount of money. We should note that this wasn't the normal way of finding a queen. Normally, a queen was found from other noble families. You don't just marry some random village woman and make her queen. That's not what you do. You marry from the noble families. There's about 7 or 8 noble families that you would marry from. But for whatever reason, King Xerxes likes this idea better. Now, I will say this, it was normal for a king to staff his harem with young virgins from across the country. And the harem is for the women who are not his wife or his queen, but simply women that the king may desire to have at some point. Not only are young girls subject to live as concubines for the king, but the Greek historian Herodotus reports that about 500 young boys would be gathered each year and castrated to serve as eunuchs in the Persian court. It's a brutal act, but it's typical of how power was used in the Persian court. Because the point of this type of power is that everyone, whether you are male or female, is at the disposal of the king's personal whims. It's not like you agree to this. You are told that you will be doing this. That is how this works. Now, Xerxes is so pleased by this proposal to search the whole country for a queen that the whole Persian bureaucracy grinds into action simply for his pleasure. This is the world in which Esther and Mordecai find themselves. Esther and Mordecai live in a corrupt world ruled by corrupt men who think nothing of taking whatever they want from whoever they want, whenever they want it. There is nothing new under the sun. How do you live in this type of a world? Where is God in this type of world? These are important questions because the world has almost always been this way. Whether it's the Akkadian Empire or the Egyptian Empire, or the Roman Empire, or modern-day oligarchs and dictators, faithful believers have had to learn to navigate complex, chaotic, corrupt, worldly power systems in which they are often, at best, overlooked and ignored, and at worst, persecuted and reviled. And as we live in a world of complexity and sometimes hostility, we are forced to make choices. We have to use wisdom, and we have to know that in all things and through all things, God is at work in us and through us, even though we sometimes, or we could say we often, do not see his hand at work. In this world, we are actually going to see that faithfulness often looks less like certainty and more like wisdom under pressure. You won't always be certain of the steps you make, but you will make them with wisdom, godly wisdom, but it'll be filled with pressure. Jason said in his last sermon that God's sovereignty is not limited to ideal conditions. It is at work even when human motives are unclear, when decisions are messy, and when outcomes are not what we would expect. Throughout this book, Mordecai and Esther are presented with choices that they have to make. Now, some of those choices are severely limited. I mean, sometimes it's either do this or die, or do this or be imprisoned, but they make choices. And they make choices sometimes that we might even disagree with, but they're living in a really difficult situation. And here we are introduced to them. In the fortress of Susa, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the other captives when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took King Jeconiah of Judah into exile. So this is like way back. Jerusalem has fallen. Babylon captures it, takes all the best people out of the city to be servants in Babylon. That's where Mordecai's family comes from. Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah, that is, Esther, because she had no father or mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was extremely good looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. So as we go through this chapter, we're going to go through it by looking at the decisions that had to be made by these individuals here. It's a series of hard choices they have to make. And the first choice that was made was actually made by Mordecai and Esther's families to stay in Persia when they could have returned to Jerusalem, because by this time the exile had ended. And they were free to leave the pagan land if they wanted to. They could all go back to Jerusalem. They didn't have to stay. But Mordecai and Esther's families chose to stay. You can sort of maybe imagine the other Jewish families packing up to get out of this pagan land, looking a little sideways at these families. Why are you staying here? Why don't you come back to the holy place? Why don't you come back to Jerusalem? Why are you staying here? Well, they made a life there. Jeremiah the prophet had actually told them, prosper in this city, have families, plant gardens, make a life for yourselves here. And they did. And so they stayed. But that was a choice that Mordecai and Esther have to live with, the family's choice to stay in a pagan land. And they prospered there. It seems Mordecai is a man of some influential standing and position in the court. Now, this choice led to another complex moral choice. Mordecai's family made some choices that we might think are too much of a compromise. See, Mordecai's name is Babylonian, and it means man of Marduk, or possibly even worshiper of Marduk. Who's Marduk? He's a Babylonian god. Okay, so Mordecai, a Jewish man, is named the worshiper of Marduk. Well, that's kind of weird, isn't it? It's kind of like if someone said to you, we're going to move to India, and our child is going to be born there, and it's just easier in the Hindu part of India to just kind of go along with things, so we're going to name our Christian child worshiper of Vishnu. And you say, well, okay, just to make life easier? That's a choice they made. His name is Mordecai. Esther, too, is referred to as Hadassah, her Jewish name, by Mordecai and her family. But in public, it seems she goes by Esther, or at least by the time she comes to the king's court, she goes by Esther. A name that in Persian can simply mean star, but it also has some connotations to the deity Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. If you're named Esther today, it's not like you're named after Ishtar. It's just, that was what they were doing. You're named after, because it's a great name. My mother-in-law's name is Esther, so it's fine. That's like, in case she's watching, it's fine that you're named Esther. It doesn't have any connotation to the goddess of love and war. But for Esther, it probably did, because it would have made life a little easier. They took on these Babylonian names because the Jewish people were tolerated, but not fully accepted. And it was easier and safer to take Babylonian or Persian names. But I just want you to pause at that choice that was made. How would you feel if your son or daughter moved to another country and said, it's just going to be easier if we kind of go along with it, and we're going to name our son after a foreign god? I think you'd probably be like, I don't know. You have to? Is that really the best choice? And to this we might say, how could they compromise something like this, to be named after a false god? What a disgrace for a faithful Jewish man or woman. Better to die in disgrace, than to disgrace Yahweh by taking the name of a pagan god. Yet remember that Daniel, another exile from Jerusalem, faithful to God and faithful to God's ways, allowed his name to be changed to Belteshazzar, which means Prince of Bel, another pagan god. The point is that in a complex and chaotic world, faithful people must use wisdom in how they navigate that world. While Daniel allowed his name to be changed and agreed even to study occultic magic with the Babylonian wise men, he did draw the line at eating food that God had commanded Jews not to eat. Mordecai and his family seemingly just followed Daniel's lead. If changing their name will make life livable, we can change the name. Where do we draw the line on compromise? This is a book of wisdom. It's not going to tell you. This is up for you to figure this out. Godly wisdom. Where do you draw the line? Now, what we need to understand about the book of Esther is that it is a book about wisdom. It's about navigating faithful living with worldly realities and trusting that God's faithfulness will not fail us, even when the choices we make are filled with nuance, complexity. Sometimes there isn't really a good or bad option. It's simply we have to make a choice. This theme will keep coming up in Esther. And for those who see the world as black and white, whose mentality is, well, it's better to die than take the name of a foreign god, you're going to be a little bit disturbed by some of the choices made. And Esther is asking you to be willing to see the complexity and the nuance of how faith works in the midst of a morally complex and difficult situation. There is not always a clear, this is what you must do. Sometimes it's nebulous. We don't know. We're going to make the best choice we can based on our human limitation. And what we're going to see is that God can work through flawed decisions, not just perfectly faithful ones. And some of you are going to need this message because it's going to release you from a burden. That God can work through flawed decisions, not just perfectly faithful ones. How many times have I heard a believer say, I think I ruined my life when I did this? Just be released from that. God can work through flawed decisions, not just perfectly faithful ones. We're going to bring this all back together. But in Esther, through all the complex choices and scary situations, the hidden hand of God is at work. And Jason said last week, Esther does not simplify human behavior. It doesn't present clear-cut moral categories. Instead, it portrays a world where decisions are often mixed, imperfect, at times even questionable. Yet God's purposes continue to move forward within that complexity. Here now we come to the worst part of the chapter, the collecting of the virgins. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Just so we understand what's happening here, like David Firth puts this in his commentary, many children's Bibles and stories portray this as a simple beauty contest, or maybe a singing contest if you're a VeggieTales fan. I think it's a singing contest. But beauty is just the entry requirement. Since the means by which the woman pleases the king involves spending the night with him after the beauty treatments are concluded, we can reasonably assume that good conversation is not on anyone's mind. The suggestion of what the text is telling us is an appalling abuse of many women who, through being concubines in a harem, will be denied a life of their own. We can note that taking so many women from the provinces also denies the local man a chance at marriage. The whims of one man destroy the lives of many. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor, and immediately he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her to 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther was taken. We should understand that Esther is at the mercy of a pagan king, just as her people were. And commentators want us to note the use of the passive voice throughout this. It wasn't that Esther chose to go. It didn't say she went. It was she was taken. So note that passive voice. It expresses life from the perspective of being caught up and swept along by circumstances beyond your control. She didn't go, she was taken. Unfortunately, there are those who cannot understand complexity. And there are those who, I'm telling you, they would say this. They would say, Esther should have just not gone. The choice, they say, is easy. Die rather than submit to that. Pastor Mark Driscoll's sermon on this chapter is exactly that type of mentality. He casts Esther as an immoral woman. And he rebukes Esther in his sermon for not fighting back when she could have said no. He calls her a hypocrite and a worldly woman who got herself into this mess. When you're taken, I don't know how you say you got yourself into this mess. These types of comments remind me of comments made like, well, what were you wearing when it happened? And why were you out so late? And didn't you fight back? None of the statements by Driscoll are accurate to what the text is telling us is happening. It's not even rooted in the reality of what choice a young Jewish girl had in the face of a royal decree. Understand that this is a royal decree. It's not something you disobey unless you want to die or face long imprisonment or have your life totally ruined. Esther chooses to live. And in choosing to live, she knows she's actually choosing to most likely be forever a concubine to the king. And again, I know there might be some out there like Driscoll that would say, well, it's better to die a pure Jewish girl than to submit to a night with a pagan king. She chose a life of immorality and got herself into this mess. But this is the choice Esther makes. Esther's not giving us clear moral values. There's no Esther did right in the eyes of the Lord, and there's no Esther did wrong and sinned in the eyes of the Lord. There isn't any of that. The author of Esther wants us to wrestle with the realities of this life, where choices are often complex and often not clear-cut good or bad. And as we're going to find out, it's a good thing Esther chooses to go and obey this decree and not give her life up, because God will use her life to save the Jewish people. The hidden hand of God's power and sovereignty can't be thwarted. The one thing Esther can control is the secret of her heritage. We read that Esther had not revealed her nationality or family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. And we should note as well that the author of Esther makes no attempt to tell us that Esther at least kept the dietary laws like Daniel did, or the Sabbath law of the Jewish believers. It would be reasonable to conclude that if she's keeping her identity a total secret, then unlike her fellow exile and, ancestor Daniel, she didn't observe the Jewish dietary law or even the Sabbath. Maybe she did partially, but it would be really hard in a harem dictated by Haggai to be fully Jewish and still keep your identity. There's a very good chance she was not keeping any of the Jewish law around that. So there's those who would criticize Esther's choice to keep her Jewish identity a secret. They would say a faithful Jew would state their belief in God clearly and let whatever happens happen. Let God be your champion. It kind of reminds me of a fictional story that youth groups were often told in the late 90s. It was about a girl in a school shooting who was asked if she believed in Jesus by the gunman. And she responded, "Yes, I believe," and she was shot and killed instantly. And the takeaway of that story was that real, faithful Christians would always choose death over denying their faith. Yet Esther keeps her faith hidden. And as I reflect on that story that was told, and it's not a true story, it was sort of a hypothetical that was presented as true, but it wasn't. I wonder if a 17-year-old girl chooses to tell a deranged gunman, "I don't need to tell you anything," or chooses to remain silent and spare her life, has she sinned? Or has she made a morally complex choice under pressure? Perhaps God needed her alive to accomplish more purposes through her. Perhaps it was not time for her life to be ended, just as God used Esther's role in the palace later on. Either way, could we not say that God is at work whatever decision is made? There is no deliberate choice to sin here. It's rather the necessity of being wise in the midst of a cruel and chaotic world. Did Esther make the right choice in keeping her faith and nationality a secret? In a sense, she's simply obeying Mordecai. But it's still a choice Mordecai and Esther made. Was it the right one? Again, we can't know if this was the appropriate moral choice. The author of Esther makes no moral judgments. He just records what happens. And we're not asked to make moral judgments on Esther's choices. We're just examining the story and learning about wisdom, faith, and God's provision and his sovereignty in a broken world. And we come back to this thought. God can work through flawed decisions, not just perfectly faithful ones. We also know that God was able to do much more with Esther alive and in the palace than he would have had she chosen to refuse the decree and die, or refuse the decree and live a horrible life, or expose her nationality and maybe be thrown out of the harem. Mordecai does not abandon Esther to her fate, but remains deeply concerned for her well-being, although everything that's happening to her is now outside of Mordecai's control. The one thing Mordecai can be thankful for is that through the providential and sovereign hand of God at work, Esther finds favor with Haggai the eunuch. And Haggai goes out of his way to help Esther. God is with Esther, even in the harem, as she finds favor with everyone she interacts with. And we might imagine a harem to be a place of luxury and ease. But for these young women, the harem is a prison. You are the property of the king. You have no agency. If the king says, "Come to me," you go to him. This is a form of slavery, even if it comes with luxurious baths and perfumes and lotions and food. Remember that these women are not pampered because they are treasured as women. They are pampered so the king will delight in having them. This is a very different scenario. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz. Notice that this is a different part of the harem, and it's a different eunuch. The king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned by name. The scriptures are making clear what's happening in a fairly subtle way, because it's a little bit stomach-turning when you really think about it. Each woman goes into the king at night and leaves the next morning. They do not go back to the harem of virgin women. They go to a new group of women, the concubines. After their night with the king, they now belong to the king and the king only. They may never see the king again. He has hundreds of concubines, but they're his. And if he ever remembers them and wants them, they are at his beck and call. That is where they go to. They don't go back to normal life. It's not like, "Oh, the king didn't want me, so I just go back to life." No, you belong to him now. You're his property. That's what's happening here. This is the world that Esther is operating in, and she doesn't have a choice in this. She's not going home no matter what happens. Marian Taylor writes that although some commentators almost glamorize Esther's Cinderella-like rags to riches story and imagine that all girls want to be queen, it is important for us to pause for just a moment and reflect upon the sexual violation of the voiceless girls herded into the king's harem. Through all this, Esther chooses to not resist. She chooses to go along with everything that's happened to her. And I think we could easily see what happened to Esther as a form of sex trafficking from the ancient world. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the 10th of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. This date is important because at this moment in time, King Xerxes has lost every battle that his military has been engaged in. It is the coldest, rainiest time of the year. He is not in a good mood. It would be almost impossible for anyone to please the king in this moment. But Esther does. Again, let me pause here. There are those who would be harshly critical of Esther's choice to follow through on going to the king. And it seems that even following advice would allow her to please him more. And some try to paint Esther as an immoral woman. And others point out that Esther was taken. She was a captive in the harem. And that this behavior of hers to kind of go along with it and try and find favor with people to make life bearable is often seen in those who've been victims of sex trafficking. There's only so much you can take before you say, it's just easier to go along with it. My life is only going to be good if I just go along with what these people want of me. Either way, the author of this book is not making any moral judgments or statements. This is simply what happened. Did Esther secretly enjoy life in the harem? Was she disgusted by it and simply in survival mode? We don't know. But in many ways, we see that Esther had limited choices. Royal decrees that demand you go to the harem are not easily ignored, not without dire consequences, possibly even death. Again, while we've seen that some dogmatic individuals would rather have Esther die than choose to submit and live, that's easy to say when it's not your life. Esther chooses to live. And Esther makes a final choice, to listen to Haggai, the king's eunuch, and take only what he suggested in her time with the king. And that was apparently very good advice. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Here's the final choice that Esther makes. She chooses to become queen. And even in this choice, you have a morally complex decision. Because by agreeing to marry the king, in a sense, I mean, he's got a lot of other women too, but she's queen, she's married, agreeing to be with the king as his queen, Esther is violating the clear command against intermarriage between Jews and pagan peoples given by God in Deuteronomy 7. So right away, again, we have another choice made. You go, well, you broke the law of Moses. You're not supposed to do this. So Esther can be a hard read for us because unlike other biblical books, it is not a prescriptive way to live life, but a descriptive reality of having to live within broken and corrupt worldly systems. This book is not saying go be an Esther, but it's not saying don't be an Esther. It's simply giving us a glimpse into the complexities of living a life of faith in a broken and corrupt world. As Karen Jobes puts it, the author's silence makes it virtually impossible for us to use Esther's behavior as a moral model. How would you use this episode from Esther's life to teach virtue to your teenage daughter as she stands on the threshold of womanhood? What message would she pull from Esther chapter 2? Make yourself as attractive as possible to powerful men? Use your body to advance God's kingdom? The ends justify the means? We can't hold Esther up as the example to follow, because the author doesn't intend for us to hold Esther up as the example to follow. The author does not allow us to come to simple answers when we consider Esther's life in the light of Scripture. The author is skillfully describing a morally ambiguous and complex situation because that is the way real life often is in this fallen world. So Esther is not telling us what to do. It is assuring us that even when we don't know what to do, even when we have to make nearly impossible decisions, God is with us, God is faithful to us, and God can even use those awful situations to work powerfully through us. When we do not understand, we should remind ourselves of what we do know. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. I'll just come to the end here with Karen Jobes. This episode from Esther's life offers great encouragement and comfort when we find ourselves in situations where every choice is an odd mix of right and wrong. Only God knows the end of our story from its beginning. We are responsible to him for living faithfully in obedience to his word in every situation as best we know how. But are you perfect? Am I perfect? No. I'm human. I'm going to live as faithfully as I know how, and I'm going to make mistakes when I do that. I'm going to make the wrong choice sometimes. And even if we make the wrong decision, our God is so gracious and so powerful that he is able to use that weak link in a chain of events and choices that he will perfect his purposes in us and through us. He who began a good work in you will see it to completion. Do you believe that? And can anything stop that? No. So some of you need to receive this. If you regret a decision, if you've made a choice that you're not sure was the right one, God does not abandon his children. His plans and purposes for you are not so easily undone. You are not that powerful. Even wrong choices can be redeemed by God, who is a redeeming God and delights in making all things new. You will have opportunities to step into the fullness of God's plans for you. One wrong choice or one mistake in your life cannot derail your whole life. Esther, in a few chapters, will realize all her choices, limited as they were, brought her to the moment where she can save her people. God was at work behind the scenes through it all. And I'm sure there are times when Esther said, where is God in this? I'm going to call the worship team up as we close. Esther may have looked back on this episode of her life with shame and regret, or she may have looked back on it with clear conscience, knowing that she acted as wisely as she knew how at the time. In either case, every one of us also have those types of episodes in our own lives. And Esther's story shows us that we can just entrust those things to the Lord and move on. What's done has been done. God is not punishing you now for a choice you made. Not if you're choosing to live faithfully for him now. You can entrust that to the Lord and you can move on. And I want the story of Esther to put you at ease. You won't always know the right choice to make. It won't always be clear to you. However, you cannot stop the plans and purposes of God in your life, especially if your desire is to live faithfully and to follow Jesus. You can't thwart God's plans and purposes for you so easily. And I want you to remember that the God who purchased you with the precious blood of Christ is not going to abandon you the moment you make a misstep, because he is a father to his children. He knows how weak we are. He remembers that we are only dust. And while we should seek to make faith-filled and godly decisions led by the Holy Spirit, we remember that God can work through flawed decisions, not just perfectly faithful ones, and his purposes will come to completion. I just invite you to stand and worship with us as we just praise God for a God who does all things for our good, and he works all things together for the good of those who love him. Let's praise our God together.